This image depicts how I've come to view life's happenings. And as a consequence, it has come to house my main categories of organization. And to start laying them out for you, I'd like to begin with a question. What is it that things do? Well, I suppose it depends on what that thing is. But this is the sort of response that I don't find to be very helpful. So, I'm going to generalize and hypothesize by asking a slightly different question. What is it that anything could do? Well, what if anything could sort, gain, and flush? By virtue of it being a sort, gain, and a flush. Well, it seems strange and somewhat arbitrary. Which is the point, but perhaps a better picture can be painted by explaining what I mean by each of these actions. So, what is sorting? Well, separation, distinguishing, setting apart from other things, from other sorts. How could that be? Well, that's what a sort would do. As I see it, a sort is an identity, a character, a kind, a type, a distinguishment separate from other things. A sort is a difference doing what it does, constantly differing. Well, what about gaining? Obtaining, claiming, increasing sums by attaining, which makes a gain something of a sum, a possession, an acquisition, something had, something subsumed, perhaps even something assumed. And in this, it only continues to assume. Which brings us to flushing, flowing, suddenly rushing, dispersing, making a flush, a projection, a surge, a stream, out and away, to something else, anything else, to some other sort that has something to gain and yet another thing to flush. And so begins the process, again and again and again. And from this, you can begin to see vague notions of infinity, but we're not going to go there, fortunately, for you and me. Instead, I'll move on to how I've actually been using these concepts, and to do that, we shall transcend this feeble first dimension and move into the second one. Now, what in the void is going on here? The line reveals the answer, it just has to be viewed in a different light. Let us revisit the previous question. Assuming anything could do anything at all implies that anything does in the first place. So, what the heck is doing? No idea. But what if we could simply call it moving? And by moving, what if there was a relationship between something's prior position and where it ends up? Well, we'd have the thing, its motion, and its relation to where it's going. Naming them, we'd have the body, the act, and the bond. Now, what if we were to treat each of these as sorts? After all, they're all separate, distinguished things treated as identities. And supposing they're treated as such, could each of them have a gain and a flush of their own? Let's look to the first dimension again. We see that it follows a sequence of sorting, gaining, flushing into another sort that gains and flushes. So each one could, strictly, just represent each part of the sequence. This would mean that each column individually sorts, gains, and flushes into another sort that gains and flushes. And since we're trying to mirror the first dimension, each column would loop upon themselves just like the first dimension. And to more clearly show this loop, we'll add an extra row that represents the sort function itself, and bring this chart to completion. With this, our categories are all laid out, and naming each of these, well, I suppose we'll get to that later. But before we move on, I should say one more thing. There's a third dimension to this, and this dimension is a means of capturing the familiar patterns and structures that appear in our world, both big and small. But it's not going to be discussed. Not here, not now, and certainly not in any of these video presentations. But as alluded to in the preface, this is where the bulk of my curiosity currently resides. For now, we'll proceed to the main event. The types, their aspects, and a small overview of how each of them seem to manifest, specifically from what I've observed in people. The types, body, act, bond, each have 3 aspects, and moving forward, each type will be explained along with their aspects, in the order of gaining, flushing, and sorting. And since you're able to watch them in any order, I suggest starting with the one that is the most obvious, blatant, and honestly favored in our technological, modern world, and yet, strangely at the same time, underappreciated, ignored, and overlooked: the body.